Welcome to the Bros of Gardening. I'm Mike Westphal, your host, with my co-host Daniel Van Dyke. And behind the scenes is our producer Alex, who will be asking us questions, guiding us through this week's topic, which is winter gardening or winter landscaping. What are you doing in the winter? What can you do when it's cold? So we'll get into it. What you got for us, Alex?
All right, so winter gardening means different things to different people. Where do you guys generally start?
So, I think, again, kind of like you alluded to, I think winter gardening is obviously a very diverse thing depending on where you're at throughout the country.
Depends on where you live.
So, for example, we're here in southeastern Virginia in the Tidewater area. And obviously we have some cold weather that we have to deal with, but at the same time, we don't usually have consistently freezing temperatures.
Right.
And so for us, landscaping in the winter can really be kind of normal as far as planting, and you can kind of plant year round. But we collaborate with garden centers all over the country, and some of them have to stop landscaping in middle of November because that's when it starts to freeze and get so cold. And so I think first, we've talked about zones a few times. Really paying attention to your lows and your highs in the wintertime can kind of dictate what you can do. You're going to deal with. And so I think that's kind of the first step, is looking at what winter gardening and landscape is for your area.
Yeah.
And then from there, you can kind of build out a plan, and you can do a lot of different things. Even if it is freezing, or even if it isn't the best time to plant, there's still a lot of things you can do in the winter.
There's always options in the winter. And that's what I tell customers is, if the ground's not frozen, you can plant.
Absolutely.
So it's a pretty easy kind of recommendation. We happen to live, like you mentioned, in the southeastern part of Virginia. Look at if you've got bodies of water that are nearby, I always tell people, look at the temperature if you can find it. We're nearby the Chesapeake Bay.
Absolutely.
So you can look at the Chesapeake Bay temperature, and typically your soil temperature is going to be somewhere in a 5 to 6 degree range around that water temperature. So let's say the Chesapeake Bay is 49 degrees. Well, that means the soil temperature is 42, 43 degrees, which means you can plant. Starts to get lower, starts to get a little bit scarier. You can also tell, I always tell people, you got the best tool right there on your hands. Use your finger. If the ground is solid and it's frozen, if your containers, if you got pots with soil in it and it's frozen, then you're not going to be able to do much. But once it thaws, then you can definitely do a lot. And It's a great time to plan and think about different things. Pruning. We're going to get into a lot of these different topics, but you might want to do a little bit of prepping for cold. So if it hasn't been crazy cold yet, or if you're worried about your plants getting through the cold, or maybe you didn't do some prep, what can you do? And I think for me, it's always mulch. Mulch is one of the best insulators that you can use for your plants and your root systems. It really helps protect them. A lot of people talk about putting sheets over things or row covers for your vegetable plants, and that's a pretty deep subject too, so we probably won't get into that. But I think mulching is one of the best things you can do for your landscape.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I always tell people too, kind of like you're saying is, we usually recommend mulching, about once a year. And so if you can kind of time that up for like a late fall or something like that before you hit that really cold winter stretch, mulch is the ultimate insulator. And that's what you're really trying to do, is you want to insulate that root system.
For sure.
That's what you really are trying to. And, you mentioned the temperature of the ground, and that's such an important, the air temperature can change so drastically so quickly. But it's going to take a lot of consistently cool and freezing weather to really start to change the temperature of the ground like that. Yeah. And so that's where, one day in freezing temperatures isn't going to change the survivability of your plant material and stuff like that. It's that consistent cold that can start to cause you a few issues. But I think insulating those root balls with mulch is certainly, mulch has a lot of functional purposes, but if you can time it up to get a fresh layer of mulch, that's just going to help you that much more in the wintertime, especially with plants that maybe are a little bit more temperamental with cold weather. Some things aren't going to be bothered by it, whether they have never seen mulch, it doesn't matter, But things that are a little bit more temperamental are definitely going to appreciate that kind of fresh layer of mulch, heading into the wintertime.
And how many inches do you typically recommend?
So, when we're doing when we first start doing, a new installation, if it's on bare ground, we'll do about 3 inches of mulch, kind of uniform depth of 3 inches. A lot of times within a year time period, you might have lost the coloring and some of that, but all your mulch isn't going to be gone. So you might have to only, do 1.5 inches or a top dress, that we call it. But we are usually looking to create about a uniform depth of 3 inches for the mulch. And that's really what we're aiming for. And that'll be dictated by how much mulch you have in your beds. And so going out and checking those types of things don't aim for 3 inches every time. You're probably wasting some money and might be doing a little overkill, and you start to build the beds up too high. And so, if you can get, and again, you can, if you do see a lot of, really cold temperatures, you live in a colder environment where you get some of those consistent temperatures, you can, go a little bit heavier on the mulch right up around the plant. The nice thing about mulch, it allows the water. You don't want to pile soil on top of the crown of the root ball, but you can obviously mulch on top of the root ball because that still allows the water to pass through. And so that's a good way to insulate it because you can't do that with the soil.
And make a note and just make sure to kind of spread it a little bit thinner once we hit the spring time frame.
Sure.
I think another great tip is watering. I think, people you don't want your plants to freeze. If you're going to head into a freezing period, you don't want your plants to be frozen with no source of water around it. So it's actually better to water your plants before we get a freeze. So if you see a week of really, really cold temperatures and your landscape is dry, go out and water your plants.
Sure.
Just so that water freezes around the root ball, and then as it thaws, it can drink, because otherwise you could be stuck without water for 2 or 3 weeks, depending on how long your cold is. You got to be a little bit more careful with your containers. You don't want to water your planters and have them freeze and crack and break, and we'll get into maybe a little bit of that here in a little bit. But definitely be careful about having a dry period, heading into a freezing period. That can definitely, be a recipe for disaster. Sure. So we want to make sure we caution people on that. All right. Alex, you got a question for us?
Well, let's get into winter planting versus winter planning. What do you do if the weather is either temperate or terrible?
So, I think that's really the question. If it is a fairly, mild climate, wintertime really is a great time to plant. It can be a very low stress time period for plant material. Yeah, you might not get a ton of root growth. It's not necessarily going to get established as quickly as it might, in fall or spring. But at the same time, I've always told people, especially in our area, I'd much rather plant in January than I would in June, or July. And just because from a stress level for the plant material, I think it's a lot less stressful time frame. So if you do have an environment like that, and obviously as you work your way down south, there's going to be a lot of in different environments and climates that are going to lend itself to planting in the wintertime, and you might not have any change really over the winter. That being said, if you do have, at least on the landscape side of things, I love to kind of take a step back. And this is something I've heard you mention plenty of times as well, and kind of plan out, we use the saying plan now to plant, in the spring, so even if it is a little too cold, or maybe, availabilities and things like that, depending on what type of garden you're planting, might be a little bit tough. So if you do have some of those types of things, you can really just start to plan out and get a sense so that when the weather does turn, or when you do, you are ready for that to go, you're all planned out and you're ready to, get the process moving. We always tell people, get your landscape design done in January.
Right.
If you want it planted in the spring, if you want it planted in March or whatever the case may be, plan for that now. Don't call in the middle of March, or whatever the case. Don't start that process. Do your research. Go to your local garden center, talk through with them, and get a really good idea of what you want. So then that way, when the weather turns, or it's just even if you're doing it yourself, you might just not want to be outside in cold temperatures.
Right.
So, it could be as simple as that. Is when you're ready to work on it, you're ready to go.
Yeah. If you can plant, go for it.
Yeah.
Because your plants will benefit from it. You're right. Selection might not be as good, but if you find something that you need to add to your landscape and you can dig in the soil, I say go for it.
Absolutely.
You got one of the longest time frames before summer hits, which is going to be the most stressful time on majority of plants. So getting them now so that the roots can establish in the spring, and then you're not watering as heavily in the summer.
Exactly.
So if you can plant, go for it. It's a great thing to do. If you can't, or if you don't want to, or if you just don't think you know what to plant, planting is a great option. I always say this is the time you can see the bones of the landscape. So
Absolutely.
you can, your trees have lost all of its leaves. Your deciduous plants have lost their leaves. And your evergreens are kind of, you can see the shape of them a little bit better. You can kind of, really see into the landscape. It's not as lush and full as it might be in the spring, summer, and fall. So it's a great time to kind of, spend some time doing that. You also need to kind of go back and say, hey, what did I not like about last year?
Sure.
Maybe this plant needs to be removed because it struggled, or maybe it needs to be transplanted, or, all of these different things. And while you might not do them at that specific time, it's a great time to just jot down some notes. I always tell customers on the retail side when they come into the store, if you have a little bit of a plan, man, we can knock out some stuff.
Absolutely.
You don't have to. We got plenty of people that come in that are weekend warriors that, say, hey, I don't have a plan, but point me in the right direction and get me going. So that's what we'll typically do. But if somebody comes in in and they've got a little sketch of a bed they might want to do, or maybe they're doing vegetable gardening in the spring for the first time, hey, I want to build some raised beds. Sure. All of those things are great to kind of get planned out and kind of think through before we get in there. I mean, you talk about seed starting. Seed starting is coming up soon. So if you're doing vegetables from seeds, herbs from seeds, any of that, maybe even flowers from seeds, then, you want to start planting that.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So great question. So yeah, if you can plant. If you can't plant, plan.
Well, one other thing I did when we talk about like the planning process is the pruning aspect of it too. Right. That's something I forgot to mention. I do apologize. But when we're talking about landscaping in the wintertime, one thing that we do like to do, around here, obviously we talked about, we have a lot of shade trees in this area, and when they defoliate, they drop leaves. So everybody talks about fall cleanups. Well, I really tend to suggest a winter cleanup or an early winter cleanup, because nothing's more frustrating than having somebody come out, clean up your yard, and you mulch, do whatever you need to do, and then 2 days later, so many leaves have fallen that you can't even see your landscape. So really, if you can wait until the end of fall when those leaves have finally stopped dropping, or at least the majority of them have, that's a great time to really clean up your landscape. Again, like you mentioned, to piggyback off what you said, things defoliate, and you can really see the branch structure. I mean, we talked about it on our previous podcast. One of my favorite trees is a Japanese maple.
Right.
And a lot of times, Japanese maples, they have a very unique growth habit where branches will cross and stuff like that.
Yep.
Well, when they're flushed out, you can't really see that branch structure.
Yeah.
But when they defoliate, you can see the branch structure perfectly. So if you want to eliminate cross branches, you can really get in there, thin it out, open it up, so you can get some more airflow in there.
Yeah.
And that's really what you're trying to do. And so that's a great time to do things like that, depending on the plant. And like you said, I mean, even with evergreens, in the wintertime, they're not going to push a ton of new growth, where you cut something in late spring, it's going to have, new growth within the next couple weeks, which isn't a bad thing. That means it's happy and healthy. But, if you're trying to get that kind of well manicured look, if you do some pruning in late fall and stuff like that, it's going to give you the longest period of time where it's going to hold that shape.
Right.
So there are a lot of things you can do. Most importantly, like I said, pruning, pay attention to the type of plant material it is, obviously, but, it's a great time to prune deciduous shrubs and do some heavy pruning, because again, it's just a less stressful time of the year for plant material and
for
things
sure.
like that.
Yeah, I mean, pruning, it's one of the best times to prune. I mean, especially when you're talking about trees. I mean, Japanese maples, crepe myrtles, fruiting trees, any of your ornamental fruit trees, all of those need to be pruned in the winter time frame, so that when the sap comes up out of the base of the tree and it heals up those wounds, it heals before spring really starts and before the insects and disease start to blow around and move around. So it's a very, very important time to look at your pruning and get some of it done. There are numerous different time frames to prune your plants, and that's a very in-depth topic that we could go into later in the future. But like you said, deciduous plants, you're probably pretty safe on pruning them. Hydrangeas is a 30-minute discussion in itself. And it's very hard to describe how to prune something, on a podcast, but certainly it's a great time to prune. Shaping evergreens is what I tell people. You're doing a light pruning on your evergreens to shape them a little bit. You're not doing a hard prune until you're a little bit closer to spring or in the spring season. Yeah. Your spring blooming plants, you're typically waiting until after they're done blooming.
Sure.
But crepe myrtles, roses. I mean, Valentine's Day is my easiest day to remember for roses. Of course, makes sense, and that's when you get out and prune those. So lots to prune in the winter. Lots of things that you can look at. Lots of planning. I love the thought of waiting on the fall cleanup, or doing a little bit of fall cleanup in the fall, but in the winter is when you really can get in there and do a lot of cleanup. And it kind of takes a little bit of that off your plate for the spring.
Sure.
Which, spring is a great time to really focus on planting and watering and getting things established and getting back out into the garden and enjoying it. And if you got to get out there and do a bunch of pruning because you didn't get to it, or raking a bunch of leaves or cutting a bunch of limbs up and that kind of stuff, then you'll get to spring a little bit sooner if you've done it in the winter.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that we don't deal with as much on the landscape side of things, but I know you deal a ton of, is houseplants too.
Yeah.
I mean, you can certainly go with houseplants, and so you can elaborate on that much more than I could, but I know that's when I always am like, get excited about houseplants, because there's not much to do, or maybe the ones outside are going dormant, or whatever the case.
And some people just can't stand the cold. Yeah. I don't want to be out in the cold. I don't want to do it. I'm not even going to go out there and attempt it. And if you've got a foot of snow on the ground and you just can't do anything literally in the landscape or in the garden, or if you don't have a whole lot of space, houseplants are an amazing option. I mean, there's a huge assortment. I think for experienced houseplant owners, winter is a little bit trickier over time because it's how much do you need to water.
Sure.
But your watering gets a little bit less in the winter time frame. But if you're new to houseplants, it's a great time to do it because most of your garden centers are stocking up right now, and you're going to get a huge assortment to kind of pick through and kind of choose from. It's a great time to ask them questions because they've got a little bit of extra time that they can spend with you, and you can really delve into becoming a little bit of a houseplant expert yourself and bringing those plants in. And I think, just like gardening outside or doing landscape, houseplants is the same thing.
Yeah,
you're going to have some errors. I've killed many a houseplant, but I love them and I keep on trying them. Yeah. And now I've got somewhere around 30 to 40 houseplants that I can kind of maintain, and I've enjoyed it in the winter. Most of your indoor plants are tropicals.
Sure.
So they're, tropical based, and they're not going to love, I have them in a sunroom that gets pretty chilly in the winter. They tend to kind of go a little bit dormant to some degree, so I don't have to water them as much. But keeping an eye on them, doing a little bit of planning, same thing. I'm kind of doing a similar thing, planning on upgrading some of the pots and putting them into bigger pots as the spring approaches. And then that way we'll see a boost of growth, staking things, doing a little bit of pruning here and there. So it's a great time to get into houseplants if you're not into it already. If you are into it, add to your collection because you might not want to go outside and brave the cold.
Well, it's funny you use the tropical reference because I've said, when you're walking through here, even at McDonald Garden Center, you walk through, you come off of the deck. Obviously, there's some cold days here, and, a lot of the stuff has gone dormant outdoors. And then you walk into the greenhouse and you feel like you're in this tropical jungle kind of houseplant paradise. So it can be refreshing and kind of brighten up some of these cold winter days for sure. For sure.
And plant people are happy people, so why not bring plants into your home and enjoy them there as well as outside? So I think that's a great option and idea for people to consider if they're not willing to brave the cold, or maybe they're stuck inside because they just got too much snow on the ground. So all right, Alex, what else we got?
Is there a certain plant material that you would recommend for colder climates?
I mean, yeah, there's definitely, we live in kind of an interesting area right here where we kind of have a mix of some different climates. And so, during the summer, it might feel like, one extreme, and then it can feel like the other extreme. And so I think obviously there's different, hardiness levels and things that can grow in colder environments. And I think that's a great question because I think that's a really good point when you're planning out your landscape and paying attention to those types of things. So yeah, I mean, some of the plant materials around here that can do better, your broadleaf evergreens, again, we talked about azaleas and, those things, I always tell people those things are popular for a reason, right?
Yep.
You talk about azaleas all the time, hydrangeas. I mean, obviously they've been around forever, but they are very hardy. They can survive in a lot of different environments. They give you color and things like that. And so, but then there are also things that are a little bit more temperamental. Like, I mean, people, we live at the beach. And so one of our biggest requests is palm trees. And so, you see these major and these monster palms all over the place down in more tropical areas, but they can be a little bit more temperamental. But there are, we talked about mulching a little bit earlier. There are different things you can do with wrapping them if you do really want to try to accomplish kind of that tropical feel. And then, so obviously plant choice is a big one. And that's also why, we talk about the annuals versus the perennials. A lot of that has to do with obviously the winter time.
Yep.
So, one of my favorite things to do is actually use house plants, but use them as annuals. We talk about kind of trying to accomplish that tropical aesthetic. But so that means in the wintertime, you're ripping out probably some dead houseplants because you're basically embracing the fact that they are going to be an annual plant, which means you're going to have to replace them each year.
Yeah.
But you can get some really good color for,
for sure
7-8 months out of the year. So I think, sticking with, and that's again, paying attention to your hardiness zone is huge, which you've touched on a few times. And I think, making your plant choices based upon what can survive. I mean, we talked about in our earlier podcast about low maintenance. You'll probably hear me reference Goshiki osmanthus and a couple other things like that. But again, all of those things do really well in the cold.
Yep.
Obviously, the conifers and things like that thrive in the cold. They're going to struggle maybe a little bit more in the summertime.
Right.
They're gonna have a little bit harder time with the heat. But all those types of things, your different conifers, most broadleaf evergreens, can survive. And again, just paying attention to that kind of stuff is really what we recommend.
Yeah, I mean, go to your U.S. Department of Agricultural website and look up the plant hardiness zones. It's pretty simple, but it can be pretty confusing too. I think, when I think of winter and cold hardy plants, I typically go, just because of the zone we're in, I typically go to conifers, which is, your arborvitaes, your junipers, your spruce, your firs, all of those different things, which a lot of them don't grow extremely well. Now, they'd be happy outside in the winter when it gets 20 degrees. But if you look at their hardiness zones, it could be negative 40 to 20 degrees.
Yeah.
So it's if those plants really love the extreme cold, maybe they don't like the extreme heat that you might have too. So the best way that I explain it to customers is to say, hey, look at your zones. If it's zones, we're in zone 8 here in the southeastern part of Virginia. If we're in zone 8 and the plant grows best in zones 8 to 10, well, you're on the borderline of that plant hardiness. I mean, you're looking at it and saying, hey, this is about as cold as that plant can take.
Sure.
Because 9, 10 starts to reach down into the, Carolinas down to Florida. So then if it's zone, 5 to 8, you're still on the borderline. It might be more of that, Colorado spruce or, a juniper of some sort. So looking at those different types of zones to kind of help you figure out where you are. Now, if it's zone 5 to 9, 5 to 10, you're right in the middle of it. So it depends on where your zone is. And then I'll probably say this in almost every episode because I work for a local garden center and so do you. And so it's talk to them. They know what grows in the area.
Absolutely.
We've been here for 80 years.
Yeah.
I mean, we know what grows in this area. So we're not going to sell you a plant that isn't hardy to some degree. And if it is, or it's borderline, we're probably going to tell you.
Absolutely.
Pittosporum is a great example.
Sure.
Or oleander. Two really kind of, they could be tropical, I guess you could say that, but they're probably pushing their limits about as far north as they can come here.
Absolutely.
And people want them.
Yeah.
And we get away with them pretty frequently here
Absolutely.
on this kind of peninsula of Virginia.
Yeah.
But on the true peninsula of Virginia, you might not.
Yeah.
So, that zone, we're literally right on the border of like 8A to a 7B. So that gets a little bit more in depth, and I don't want to go down that road, but we're on the borderline of an 8-7.
Right.
So, sometimes the winters get a little bit colder and sometimes you see that winter damage. So you mentioned that too. I think just a quick point on winter damage to plants. How do you protect it? You can wrap them. You can do different things. If you get snow, don't knock the snow off. Right. I think that's huge. Snow is a natural insulator. So if your boxwood or your shrub is leaning super, super hard or it could break a branch off, knock the snow off. But if it's not, then leave it because it'll actually insulate those leaves. Not to get into the too scientific part of transpiration, but the loss of moisture through the leaves. If it freezes and there's no moisture in the leaves, then you end up with winter burn.
Yeah.
Wilt proof is a great way to protect your plants from winter burn. If you've got boxwoods, those types of things, you can cover them. You can do lots of different things. But typically the best advice that we're ever going to give people is plant plants that grow in your zone.
Absolutely.
And that way you don't have to worry about
Well,
it.
it's funny you mentioned that because like we talked about, we have obviously being in Virginia Beach, the beach aesthetic is a popular one that we deal with a lot on the landscape side of things. And so you mentioned things like Pittosporum and things like that, and even Podocarpus and some of these types of things, which I love them. But we are, it's been, again, it's so funny how from one area to the next, I mean, you can take a 30-minute drive across the bridge and we're on the actual peninsula.
Right.
And those don't do as well there, but you can't.
Don't see many palm trees over
You
there.
can get away with it. And so we're always trying to find things that are climate and zone appropriate that still maybe give the feel of kind of that tropical beach theme. And Pittosporum is a great example. It's one that, I've had a love-hate relationship with because we do deal with it a lot. But again, like you say too, we reference it often, but being here, working at a local garden center, if we carry it here, chances are it should do well in this area. That's our plan. I mean, we guarantee our plants for over a year, which obviously covers the winter. So we're not going to want to give out or, sell a lot of things that are going to get returned to us or have a bunch of issues. So I think that's a pretty good barometer of what does well is if you're local garden centers, and that's where the local part really comes in handy, is because, they're not going to want to carry a lot of things that aren't going to do well because, we want obviously the customer to be successful. We want our material to be successful. And so we're not going to carry a bunch of stuff that is too temperamental. And so I think it's a great place to start too. And again, a lot of times, we have the luxury of just being able to go out and walk the floor and look around again on the landscape side of things when we're trying to design or do whatever. I always encourage the designers, go out and walk the floor.
Right.
You can see a variety of plants. You see what does well in this area. And again, a lot of times if we carry it, that's a pretty good idea that it should do well in this
Right,
area.
right. Yeah, I mean, and we've tested plants. The landscape tests them all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, you might come to us and say, "Hey, we're having an issue with this plant. We've planted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and so now we're starting to see an issue, or this is popping up." I mean, you mentioned with pittosporum. I think palms is a great. You mentioned that one earlier. Palms is a great one because there's so many different varieties of palms, and we sell one.
Yeah.
We recommend one.
Yeah.
So it's the windmill palm, and that's what we know is probably one of the cold hardiest palms. Sure. And people want all these different types of palms, and it's, hey, this is really the recommended palm. Now, we've got lots of different options. If you want a tropical look, we can get you a tropical look, whether you have a palm tree or not. But know your plants, know your zones. I think that's super helpful. And plan, prepare, do some pruning. If you can get out in your yard, do some work. If you can't, grow some houseplants.
Absolutely.
Lots and lots of different options. Gardening, the possibilities are endless. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Alex, for joining us for this podcast. And that was a great discussion on winter gardening. Next week, we'll be talking about small space gardening. So we'll dive into that topic next week. Thanks for tuning in.